to the East Asia Strategy Forum for the sixth panel of this two-day conference titled Troubled Waters, Averting War in the South China Sea and Taiwan. My name is Chris Mott, and I am the Research Fellow for the International System 2050 program here at IPD, a North American think tank dedicated to advancing prudent realism and military restraint in foreign policy. Maritime disputes in the South China Sea and the ongoing risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait are major fault lines for regional stability in Asia. Cross-strait relations are at a standstill amid questions on the Biden administration's commitment to Taipei, debates over strategic ambiguity, recent arms sales, and the evolving force postures of Beijing and Washington. In the South China Sea, freedom of navigation operations and negotiations over a joint code of conduct and role of U.S. defense treaties with Manila have yet to generate a sustainable path to de-escalation and stability. This discussion will explore the risk of hot conflict and evaluate the most serious flashpoints for regional instability. We at IPD have been following these issues for some time. In fact, we have devoted ourselves to producing an up-to-date narrative of the contest and its origins in this region. We've recently concluded a 5-month running series on the current landscape of Sino-American relations, which convened an interdisciplinary group of scholars and practitioners from IR theorists to political theorists, historians, and military strategists in a series of panels and discussions which are available for viewing on IPD's YouTube and Rumble channels. Among this group was Lyle Goldstein, who quite fortunately is also a panelist for today's session and will be joining us shortly. In these prior panels, it became obvious to us that Taiwan was the point of greatest concern for the majority of participants. We would now like to dig deeper into that topic with our current speakers. A summary of our past engagement on this topic can be found on our white paper, released earlier this week, called On the Brink, Averting a New Cold War Between Washington and Beijing, prepared by Research Director Artem Moini, our intern, Johnson Romero, and myself. The report identifies securitization, threat inflation, and absolutist conceptions of exceptionalism as real dangers to both the US and China, as well as regional stability in Asia. You can find the link to this report below, and I urge you all to read it and let us know your feedback. And now, for the main event, let me introduce our excellent moderator, Kelly Blaus. She is a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute, as well as editorial director of the affiliated Responsible Statecraft publication. She formerly served as a contributing editor to the American Conservative magazine, reporting and publishing regular articles on US war policy, civil liberties, and foreign policy since 2007. She spent 15 years as an online political reporter for Fox News at the channel's Washington, D.C. bureau. Additionally, she currently co-hosts the Crashing the War Party podcast. We are delighted to have her with us today. Kelly, thank you for being here. I will let you introduce the panelists.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for that very kind introduction. I am so proud to be here and handed this role at today's panel and the opportunity to participate in this conference overall. I would like to thank the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for inviting me and involving me in it. I am very impressed by their growth as an organization over the last year. The Institute is doing some tremendous work in gathering the best minds and analysis on the pressing foreign policy issues of our day. This event, of which the Quincy Institute is a proud co-sponsor, is just one example of how they're feeding the conversation. So thank you very much. So as Chris mentioned, the topic for today's panel is troubled waters, averting war in the South China Sea and Taiwan. There has been a lot of talk in the conference so far about the outsized role that Taiwan is playing in the current US-China policy. Moreover, the role it is playing in increasing tensions between the two powers. But we are not going to be nibbling around the edges in this panel. This panel is specifically designed to answer some of the most confounding questions revolving around the issue, including what are the most serious points of contention and risks of escalation and crisis in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea today? What are the mechanisms or policy adjustments that can stabilize the regional maritime insecurity? And perhaps most pointedly, is an absorption of Taiwan by China, either through a military attack or other means, inevitable? And if so, what can the US do? What should it do in response? If anything else, the discussions in this conference overall have suggested that there is a lot of diversity in the realism and even restraint schools of thought about whether China is truly a threat to global interests and whether it is reacting to threats by others, including the United States. There are different points of view over what the US role should be in the region. Should it lead from the front or from behind or at all? Are both sides truly readying for war, or is it saber rattling and ceremony, largely for domestic purposes? I think the issue of Taiwan brings all of these differences to bear, and I look forward to hearing from each of our esteemed panelists today on this and other important questions. So let me introduce them. Zach Cooper is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies US strategy in Asia, including alliance dynamics and US-China competition. He also teaches at Georgetown University and Princeton University, co-directs the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and co-hosts the Net Assessment podcast. Before joining AEI, Dr. Cooper was the Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a Research Fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Peggy Mason is president of the Rideau Institute, focusing on international peace and security with a particular emphasis on the United Nations, where she served as Canada's ambassador for disarmament from 1989 to 1995. Since 1996, Peggy has been involved in many aspects of UN peacekeeping training, including the development of groundbreaking UN principles on the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former fighters, the reform of UN arms embargoes, and the evolution of UN peacekeeping in the 21st century. For 10 years, Peggy was a senior fellow at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, where she lectured, participated in training for Iraqi and Kuwaiti diplomats, and chaired an advisory board to the Canadian Center for Treaty Compliance. David Welsh is a university research chair and professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. His 2005 book, Painful Choices, A Theory of Foreign Policy Change, is the inaugural winner of the International Studies Association International Security Studies Section Book Award for Best Book published in 2005 or 2006. And his 1993 book, Justice and the Genesis of War, is the winner of the 1994 Edgar Furness Award for an outstanding contribution for security studies. And joining us is Lyle Goldstein. I thought he was going to be late, but he's not. He's right on time. Lyle is Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities. Formerly, he served as a research professor at the U.S. Naval War College for 20 years. In that post, he was awarded the Superior Civilian Service Medal for founding and leading the China Maritime Studies Institute. His main areas of expertise include both maritime security and nuclear security issues. Major focus areas have also recently included the Arctic as well as the Korean Peninsula. He has published 7 books on Chinese strategy, including Meeting China Halfway, How to Diffuse the Emerging US-China Rivalry. So, I mean, we have a stellar panel lined up for you right now to tackle these important critical issues on maritime security in the region, with a particular emphasis on Taiwan. So I want to start out with a round robin for all participants. We haven't asked our participants, our panelists, to issue a particular, opening statement, but we're going to use this first question as sort of a launch point, so to speak, for the rest of the discussion. And so I issue this first question. Is China a bully? If so, what should the US be doing in the region? What should it not be doing? If China is not a bully, how is the Biden administration and Congress misinterpreting Beijing's actions? And what should the US be doing to countermand that perception? So I would like to go to Lyle first on that question, and welcome, Lyle.
Oh, well, it's great to be here, join this fabulous panel. Well, I'll be pretty quick. I guess this is kind of a lightning round, but I guess I would just start by saying that there are some things that are always characterized as bullying. I mean, unquestionably, they've got a lot of ships out there in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Getting a little bit more wonkish. In China studies, we talk about the Huangyan模式. It means like the Scarborough model, and this was the Scarborough Reef affair. In I think it was 2012, where China kind of seemed to roll the Philippines a little bit and take advantage of the situation. So there are things that are disturbing, not ideal, let's say. But looking at the big picture, and I think that's what we have to do often: step back. China hasn't resorted to a major use of force. That's good. They're surrounded by mostly weak neighbors. From Mongolia, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Kyrgyzstan. I mean, one could dream up dozens of places where China could intervene militarily in these countries, but it hasn't. So that's important. I guess generally, I think it was Kaplan who said years ago, look, the South China Sea is basically China's Caribbean, get over it. So I guess that's a way of saying there's a lot of bullies out there, and we know something about it. So I don't really like the term, and I think China's going to throw its weight around. It's inevitable, but let's hope it's more peaceful than not.
David, would you like to tackle the question?
I think Lyle put it very well. I would not say that China is dispositionally a bully, but I would say that they do occasionally bully. And those are the issues on which China cares a very great deal and feels it is entitled to some kind of deference from others. And when it doesn't get that deference, then it can behave in a very bullying way. I would also say that from 2012 to 2016, specifically with respect to the South China Sea, China did an awful lot of bullying for fundamentally bureaucratic political reasons. The PLA and nationalists inside the government had started winning debates over the internationalists and moderates in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so it was a period of very assertive nationalism, lots of bullying. After the Philippines Arbitration Tribunal ruling, those people lost clout because it was a severe loss of face for China. So with the internationalists more or less back in the driver's seat on foreign policy issues for at least a few years after 2016, you saw less bullying and an awful lot more tightrope walking, which I'd be happy to talk about more in a minute. So some of the time, yes, not dispositional.
Great. And I just want to remind our viewers today that we will be taking questions from the audience. And if you would, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will either take them at the end or we will sprinkle them throughout. We'll see how they come in and how they relate to some of the other questions that I have teed up. Zach, would you like to take it on from here?
Of course. Well, thanks, Kelly. It's great to be here and great to be on this wonderful panel. So I have a slightly different take, which is that I think almost all rising powers are bullies. If you look back at the United States when it was a rising power, maybe at relatively the same period at which China is now in terms of its relative power, take, say, the 1890s, the US certainly did some things that look a lot like bullying. So I think it's a little bit unfair to call China a bully and say that it's dispositional, because in fact, this is what rising powers do. They try and change the status quo. There's nothing inherently good or bad about that. That is just the nature of what happens with rising powers, right? The existing order was created when they were relatively weak, and they want to align that order more closely with the new balance of power. Whether we really want to call that bullying or some type of revisionist behavior, I think is a debate we could have. But I do think if you look at China's behavior, yes, it wants to revise elements of the existing status quo, and that shouldn't be surprising. As I said, that's exactly what we did when we were in a similar stage. And I think the question that we should ask now is, how is that going to be received by the countries that are neighbors to China? Singapore's Prime Minister Lee had a good comment about this a few days ago when he was asked a similar question. And he said, of course, all major powers push around smaller powers sometimes. That is sort of what they do. The difference, perhaps, is how they adapt and are received over time. And I think, don't get me wrong, the US has quite often used its power to push around smaller countries. But I think that his point in that case was, if you look at what the US has done in the region over the last 70 years, there's a fair amount of goodwill for the US in the region. And I think he was asking some questions about whether that was the path that China was going to take. And I don't think he was trying to answer that question, but I think he was trying to ask it. And I think that's the same approach I would take. I don't know that we'll see China continue the behavior it's been engaging in the last few years, but I think it's definitely possible. And I think that's why there's a lot of nervousness in the region. Thanks.
Peggy?
Thank you very much. When Zach started his comment about all rising powers bully, of course, I always take notes of everything that's being said and comment as I'm doing it. Maybe it's the practice of law that got me into that. But anyway, what I typed was very quickly, bullying is not just what rising powers do, it's what great powers do. Trump was much more overt, but the US treatment of Canada over Huawei and 5G, publicly threatening our place in Five Eyes, is bullying. But then, of course, Zach went on to make basically the same point and then go on to the more important point. But I think that, the more useful way to look at this is on this issue of misperception. And in the American context, because of the playing to the domestic audience, and because of the very hardline view of the Republicans in particular, although not only the Republicans, and Biden's precariousness politically, sometimes it's hard to know where, what's domestic and what goes beyond in terms of the China policy. And of course, the review is still going on. But I think the most important basic misperception, and I think this is not just for public consumption, is the argument that China wants to drive United States out of the region. And the rejection of any notion that a great power would not do that. And I think that's extremely unhelpful. And I also think that that United States has tended to over characterize China's behavior with respect to the South China Sea and underemphasize China's perception of its actions as necessary and reasonable in the circumstances. I mean, I'm reminded of Jeffrey Sachs' lunchtime comment about United States has 800 military bases in the region, and China has one outside the region. But China has gone berserk because it puts a military base for which a naval base for which there are good operational military reasons on one atoll. Of course, I would add that's not an entirely fair statement, because the one atoll is, of course, disputed territory. But nonetheless, I think he's making a larger point. And I will get into this later with respect to AUKUS and nuclear weapons. And that is, utter hysterical reaction, public statements by the American military about what China is doing with its modernization, and particularly what looks like potential increases in its nuclear arsenal, against the backdrop that the worst case scenario for China over the next 20 years still puts it far, far behind the United States in terms of nuclear weapons. So the rhetoric, complicates. The rhetoric complicates considerably a fair assessment of where the two sides really don't understand each other. And I guess that's where I'll stop, is that I think, many have said there's a crying need to get some real dialogue going, and not least on strategic doctrine. That's not an easy thing. You have to have some comfort level. You can't do that in the context of hysterical accusation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peggy. And we can expound on some of those themes in the next hour or so. Again, reminding listeners, viewers, that we do have a Q&A box. So if you have a burning question or a follow-up to any of what's being said here by our panelists, please put it in the box. Also, for our panelists, as we go on to the individual questions, if you would like to follow up with a two-finger on a specific point that one of your colleagues here have made, please let me know. I think what you can do here is do the raise hand icon at the bottom, and I will recognize you, and that will help keep this panel a little bit more conversational. I like to have a little back and forth going. Let's start off the questions with Lyle. Lyle, you had said, or you had written in a recent national interest article about the issue of Taiwan, and I'm quoting you here, a military conflict over Taiwan would represent a thoroughly unwinnable military scenario, entailing significant and even catastrophic US combat losses due largely to the brutal facts of geography. My question to you is, within that context, should the US get rid of its policy of strategic ambiguity where Taiwan is involved and then incur all the consequences of what that would entail? What is the danger of Washington setting a red line over Taiwan? What is the danger of not coming to Taiwan's defense? So you have people in this town, I'm in Washington, who would like to get rid of that strategic ambiguity. What is the danger of that? And if not, do we have any responsibility to defend, and what would that look like?
Sorry, a lot to chew on there, Kelly. Thank you for the question.
Coming right out of the gate.
I've just come from another Taiwan engagement talking about it, so it's really definitely at the forefront of our minds. It should be a quick repartee, though. I would say, and I'm just on the last conversation, I had raised my hand because I just wanted to mention that I'm glad Zach really, I think, said rightly that we're, in a way, this is the 1890s for China, right? This is they're sort of feeling their oats, they're building their navy, they're doing all these things. But I do think it's worth noting that now it's a different time period, of course. But I mean, if you look at American behavior, even in the Caribbean or whatever, we were using force almost every year and in some pretty massive ways. I mean, I think we actually took Colombia apart and made Panama at one point. Now, I guess we've all benefited from that. Thanks for the Panama Canal. But I'm just saying what China is doing, you could say for a rising power, China is extremely restrained. They haven't used force in a major way since 1979. So anyway, just put that out there that I think it's important. But I do think the comparison is really valid and interesting. And psychologically, that is where China's at. Now, to the Taiwan question, okay. Well, I've got about 45 minutes of remarks, but let me try to boil it down to 3. There are many reasons not to move away from strategic ambiguity. To my estimate, it's preserve the peace. Just by moving away, we may actually start the war. I think people would argue for strategic ambiguity. Often would say, look, we just got to kick the can down the road here. We don't have a solution at hand. So let's just allow diplomacy and interdependence and all these things to do their work. So I agree with all of that generally. However, I would say that I have some problems with ambiguity myself, but I don't know that my policy recommendations are not, how to put it, accepted by many. But the problem with ambiguity is you have this immense amount of misperception, right? The possibility for bluffing, so much uncertainty. Nobody's knows what's going to happen. And I do think that's part of the reason we're in this kind of potentially almost like a 1914 like moment where we're sleepwalking into a major war because nobody knows what the real policy is. I mean, I hate to say, but even the president doesn't, seems to make remarks one way one day and then the other the next. So if there are extreme dangers by putting down a red line, like I said, I think we could actually ignite the war by putting a red line down. And at a minimum, I think U.S.-China relations would reach a new nadir. I mean, we're in a bad place today, but it could get much worse. And really, the worst possible outcome that could result is we might not only go into a war, we might lose that war. And I think my estimate of the military situation is such that there's a decent probability of that happening. So we want to avoid that. And that not coming to Taiwan's aid, well, you hear a lot of arguments, Taiwan is the cork in the bottle. So we have to prevent this genie from exploding into the Pacific. We have to preserve our credibility. I don't find any of those arguments persuasive, frankly. I mean, I think our position and our credibility would be enhanced by taking a more realistic approach. Thanks.
I do have a quick follow-up because, the idea that we would not win a war against a military confrontation with China. And as somebody who is in Washington and I'm hearing both sides all the time, there seems to be this tension between this idea that, you hear this from, people on the Hill, military, that we have to be concerned about China's military buildup. And then you hear others basically talking up the U.S. side and the military might of our Navy and the preparations that we have made, the allies, the defense, the drilling, the exercises. There seems to be a question in between there. Why do you say that we would lose this war militarily? Well, can you please go into some detail as to why this should be a no-go and that we should have a more restrained posture in the region?
Okay, well, you're going to have to give me another 45 minutes. There's a lot to talk about here, and the details matter, of course, but I'll just try to be really quick. I mean, one, if you can go online and there's a piece in Real Clear Investigations where David Achmanek, he's at RAND, I think he was a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. I don't agree with him on everything, but he did say candidly, he said that there have been more than 15 war games on this issue, and the U.S. loses every single time. I mean, that's a wake-up call, folks. I didn't say that, and I didn't participate in those war games, but that checks with what I'm seeing generally. Look at another open report. This is by the RAND Corporation, also in 2015, and they said, they stated very clearly, like it's pretty obvious. The U.S. has sort of 2 air bases, more or less, near Taiwan that it could draw from. China has dozens, maybe as many as 50. I mean, that in a way that asymmetry in firepower is so striking. I worked for the Navy for 20 years, so I'm well acquainted with what our fleet can do. Most of the fleet can't get there. The carriers, it's too hot. They won't be able to get near it. So we have submarines, and there are reasons why the submarine force could not, I don't think could win this war. I can go into those, but the simple answer is that they have small magazines. They only carry about 24 torpedoes, and that's not nearly enough, and there just aren't enough of them. But look, last thing I'll say here is, China has supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. We don't. That's a big deal. China has an anti-ship ballistic missile. We don't. Again, that's a huge technological leap. And China has a deployed hypersonic weapon, and we don't. So look, U.S. military strategists need to look this over again and realize that this is a bridge too far.
David, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, again, there's lots to get into there, but the point of strategic ambiguity was to try to discourage the Chinese from taking any action, but also try to discourage the Taiwanese from doing anything provocative like issue a unilateral declaration of independence. Taiwan, from what I can tell, is smart enough not to issue any sort of new unilateral declaration of independence, But then they don't really have to, because the official position of the government is that Taiwan is already a sovereign country. The Republic of China is already independent. So there's not much more they have to say by way of asserting their autonomy vis-a-vis Beijing. So the question is, what's the point of maintaining ambiguity vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China? I think the best of all possible worlds is to make sure there is absolutely no ambiguity on the part of Xi Jinping. So, a quiet message on the side saying, look, we don't want to make a public deal out of this. We don't want to rub your nose in this, but just so you know, we will not tolerate any effort to take over Taiwan. There will be a response. And whatever the war games say, I think the fact of the matter is there would be a response. There would be a hue and a cry from within the United States, from among friendly democratic countries who feel that fidelity to our own principles requires that we not stand for that, even if it's a costly follow-up to defend our principles. And that's all quite apart from the fact that Taiwan is actually very crucial for the global economy and one of the main sources of semiconductors. Lots of good reasons, economic, moral, political, not to sit back and let China swallow Taiwan. And I don't believe for a second that we would. I think it would be a multinational effort to resist a Chinese military move. Yeah, strategic ambiguity certainly had its time in place. Now it's time to make sure that the leadership in Beijing doesn't have any misconceptions about what's going to happen.
And maybe I'm missing something, David, but do you also believe that that calls for less ambiguity on the United States part? That instead of the mixed messaging that we're hearing from the Biden administration, he actually comes out and say, yes, we are obligated to come and defend Taiwan if there is an attack. Do you believe that?
So one of two things happened there. One was that he was tired and he misspoke. And of course, he does this a lot. And the other thing that might have happened is he was just channeling his inner belief about what the United States would do. And I think that's sound. There is a solid bipartisan consensus in Washington on the importance of defending Taiwan. There's a solid national consensus on that. It's like the only foreign policy issue on which Americans are united across the board. So there really should be no doubt in China's mind. And I don't think there really is. If they have America watchers who are doing their job and not asleep, they should know this too.
Okay, so that leads, Peggy, you have your hand up. Go ahead. But make sure you take yourself off the move. Okay.
Thank you very much. I understood Lyle to be saying that the ambiguity should be ended in favor of the United States, making it clear that it wasn't going to come to the defense of Taiwan. If there's a solid American consensus, and certainly the public, if there is a public consensus, and I don't believe there is, but if there is a public consensus, then it's based on an utter misconception. And that is that this war can somehow, the United States will prevail and there will not be, incredible risks with respect to it. And I think that, a frank discussion of the military, of the fact that on balance, it'll be easy to demonstrate that it's highly likely that the United States will lose, that will introduce, some refreshing reality into the discussion of what the United States is willing to do with respect to Taiwan. On this one, I fully agree with Jeffrey Sachs. It is delusional to think that the United States is going to put United States at risk, because that is what is involved. We are, after all, talking about two nuclear powers and dangers of escalation at every turn. So it is just delusional to think that the United States is going to put its own vital national interests at stake to defend Taiwan in a losing battle.
Okay. So I was going to, well, thank you, Peggy, because that actually tees up a new question that I'm going to ask David, because I think we need to move along this thread. And Daniel Davis, who is one of our viewers right now, has put an interesting question in the chat that I'd like to pose to David, given everything that you said about the reality that if Taiwan is attacked by China, that you believe that the international community would respond. So I'm asking you, if not militarily, how would the US respond, or should it respond militarily? I'd like to tease that out on your end a little bit.
I think it would respond militarily. To me, it just seems very bizarre to suggest that the United States is going to be deterred by a grossly inferior nuclear power, such as China, when the United States has incredible reserves of nuclear capability. I mean, in 20 minutes, the United States could bring the People's Republic of China to an end.
That's not what Lyle just said, though.
If it goes nuclear,
yeah,
that's all it takes, right? So obviously nobody wants anything to go nuclear.
Right.
But
Now, China also does not have much, hardly any amphibious capability. So yes, they could do a lot of damage on Taiwan, but does that amount to them actually succeeding in taking over and annexing it? That's a different ballgame. That requires boots on the ground. Lots of ways in which that could be prevented, and probably could be fairly easily prevented for many years. So I think the military calculus is not quite as cut and dried as Lyle suggests. It all depends on your scenario for the war games, right? If it's a naval battle involving kind of the targeting naval assets, the United States would probably get its hair mussed pretty well. If it were a naval battle very close to the Chinese shores, yeah, absolutely the case. But Taiwan taking over Taiwan, that's a different war game.
Lyle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I put my hand up because I wanted to underline what Peggy said, which is, so I wanted to just underline what she said, which is that two nuclear powers have never gone to war. Nobody knows what would happen, and nobody, we can't conceive of that. By the way, a U.S. A very informed person, Admiral Stavridis, recently wrote a book called 2034, where he envisioned what a U.S.-China war would look like. And guess what? It does end with a nuclear exchange. And sorry, David, it doesn't end the way you suggested. Several American cities are vaporized. And that's not good. I don't think that's a good outcome. I can assure you that China has the capability to end the United States from a nuclear point of view. They've had it for probably 10 years, but they see a need to enlarge that capability so that I guess they can make the rubble bounce emphatically. This idea that because we have nuclear superiority that we control the situation is completely wrong, and really that's what's in fact leading us toward a cliff. And I think this institute is affiliated with Canada. I have to say, this is kind of misleading perspective. I understand a Canadian ship, I think, was recently involved in a Taiwan Strait transit, but this is like talking big, but having no stick to wield. And in my view, you've got to understand the military calculus before you kind of are willing to run the risks of conflict and even nuclear conflict. On the amphibious lift, I don't know, I didn't quite get the comment about the hair being mussed, but I mean, we're talking, I believe we could lose like half the US Navy in a couple of days actually out there. So I disagree with that. As far as the amphibious attack, look, this is 90 miles. You can cross 90 miles in a small boat. China's armada that attacks Taiwan will be something like 10,000 ships. If you think we have enough missiles and torpedoes to sink 10,000 ships, I'll tell you, you're wrong. And moreover, most of the attack will be just small boats. Anyway, they'll mostly come over by helicopter and by parachute. By the time they go up the beaches will be secure.
I'd only say that I'm not in favor of nuclear war. Obviously, I'd like to do everything to prevent a conflict in the first place. But China, for every nuclear warhead China can drop on an American city, the United States can drop 10 on a Chinese city. So it's not a balanced fight on the nuclear department. And yeah, it would be a real mess in Taiwan. So all the more reason to try to avoid it. And the question is how best to avoid it. And I don't think openly talking about bailing on Taiwan is the way to avoid it, when it seems increasingly clear that Xi Jinping has reuniting Taiwan with the mainland on his bucket list as a legacy issue for his own personal rule. So we want to discourage that ambition on his part any way we can.
Zach, you have your hand up, patiently waiting.
Well, it's such a great discussion because I think it highlights a couple of disagreements, right, between experts in the field. And, Lyle's old organization, the Taiwan Maritime Studies Institute, has done such great work in this. on a couple of different aspects of this question. And I think what we're seeing is actually experts disagree about a lot of fundamental questions related to Taiwan, right? And on this panel, I think a lot of us may disagree on some of them. So we disagree on how risk acceptant China might be, right? Is China fundamentally deterrable on Taiwan, or is it not? I think we may disagree on whether the US would actually stand up for Taiwan or not. And frankly, I don't know that anyone knows the answer to that. I'm not even sure that Joe Biden knows the answer to that. I think we may disagree on how defendable Taiwan is militarily. So for example, I agree with Lyle that if there was a US-China conflict over Taiwan, it would be very nasty for the United States. I am not sure, however, that that translates to China being able to physically take and hold Taiwan if the US and Taiwan and perhaps Japan operated effectively. But I think the problem is that there's so much ambiguity around the answers to these questions that smart people can have very different opinions. So, I also actually am not supportive of strategic clarity. I think strategic ambiguity is smarter for a whole bunch of strategic reasons. But my conclusion is very different from Lyle's, right? I actually think it is probably possible to deter China from making a move against Taiwan, at least over the next, say, 5 to 10 years. But I think we have to be realistic that our confidence level on some of these assertions should be lower than it often is from experts in Washington. So, one thing that is fascinating to look up is the Council on Foreign Relations does a poll of experts, and they ask a variety of questions, and some of them are, should the US take a tougher or less tough line on China? The answers are all over the map. But one thing that most of the experts have in common is very high confidence levels, right? Everybody is very sure that they're right, but they all have very different views about what the right answer is. So I think for me, what these conversations drive home is a little bit of cautiousness about how confident I am, at least, in what US decision makers would do, what Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders would do. And on some of these capability questions, smart people have very different views. So I think it's very hard to make definitive responses to some of these questions, which is part of why Taiwan is such a hard policymaking issue, because there are just no easy answers.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that reminds me of a recent foreign affairs article symposium that had asked the question of whether or not the United States policy on China was too hostile. And it did rate, high confidence, low confidence. And you could see the polarization between those who felt like, they felt like it wasn't either hostile enough or too hostile, and everything in between. And these were the creme de la creme, so to speak, of the Washington foreign policy establishment. It shows you the diversity in the views. But that said, on that theme of ambiguity, but also deterrence, I guess I have two questions for you, Zach. One, just to follow up on what you said. How would the United States endeavor to deter China over the next 10 years? You think that it's likely that we could do that, we meaning the United States, but how?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's easy. I think, unfortunately, the United States has been remarkably slow to respond to some of the developments that China has done through its military modernization over the last 10 or 20 years. But I still think the reason I'm a little bit more optimistic on this is amphibious invasions are the most difficult type of military operation. And China would have to do this against an island that has been preparing for this invasion for decades. Now, Taiwan probably hasn't been doing everything that many of us would have liked to see Taiwan do, so that's a separate discussion, but Taiwan has been preparing for a long time. And it would have to carry out this invasion potentially against the world's #1 military power in the US, maybe Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy as well. And oh, by the way, China, as Lyle mentioned earlier, hasn't fought a conflict since 1979, a major conflict. And it, oh, by the way, lost that war. So I think it's hard if you're Xi Jinping to be really confident that you can do this and execute effectively and come out on top. And a draw in this invasion is not a win for China, right? So if the US and China fight to a draw, that means that Taiwan is probably still not in Beijing's hands. So I think if I was Xi Jinping, I would figure, and there's some political science research out there on this, that an actual invasion of Taiwan, if it went badly, would probably mean the end of my reign, and that would probably mean the end of my life potentially as well. That's a pretty big risk to take. So I think there are a whole bunch of things the US could do. I wrote a report 5 years ago or so with 28 recommendations about what we should do to stabilize the military balance in Asia. I think very few of those things have actually been done. So I have to go into them in more detail, but suffice it to say, I think this is a hard problem, but it's a hard problem for China too. And that's why I'm probably a little bit more optimistic.
And I do have a question, a more broader question for you, but I see Lyle has his hand up.
Yeah, a lot of good points being made, and I definitely agree with Zach and everyone that, you know, experts disagree, and that's why we're having this discussion. We need to have it out and talk more in more detailed ways, and maybe we can extend it for 3 or 4 more hours. I think that'd be good, and I would love to show some slides, which I was just showing in another session. But let me just a few points. One, I think Zach said that, or somebody said that you know, we should give diplomacy a chance, and I think there's really ample scope here that hasn't been explored really. I mean, Xi Jinping met with Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan, in 2015 in Singapore. I mean, and they had a good meeting. There are ways that good, strong diplomacy can push forward a kind of solution, I think, and people often forget that. Got to disagree with Zach though on a few points here. I don't think this is regime risking to fight this war for Xi Jinping. Look, one of the problems with the CCP these days is they don't have a lot of heroes and martyrs. They need heroes and martyrs. Fighting a war gets you those, and they expect to take a lot of losses, and they kind of want them. You know, I think they could lose or draw and still, you know, get ready for the next time. We'll do it better next time. Learn the lessons and come back. I mean, that's the thing. This issue is not going away. So I think the CCP gets a lot of legitimacy from this, and even a use of force. And I think, unfortunately, I think they're kind of putting themselves in a bind here where they have to use force with their rhetoric. On combat experience, you know, you say they haven't used it since '79, but I just want to emphasize the wars that the US has been fighting for the last few decades are counterinsurgency wars. They have not prepared us for high intensity air and naval campaign. So, you know, this supposed advantage that we have, I think does not pan out. As for Taiwan preparing for this, I'm afraid it's pretty, the preparations are not there. I mean, they're very proud to announce last year they launched a giant amphibious ship. I mean, what exactly role does that play? The Taiwan Air Force and Navy would be destroyed at the piers. And you can look on Google Earth and take a look at the beaches and everything else. There's no, you know, you can't see any fortifications. This is not like the Normandy, like the Atlantic Wall or something like that, like endless pillboxes and barbed wire. No, there's hardly any of that, actually. So, you know, we can ask why that's the case. Well, part of it is they only spend, you know, 2% or less on defense. Maybe they should spend 20%. That might get them there. I agree. If they just, you know, if they just poured concrete and barbed wire and and built caves for the next 20 years, they could probably get there, but they're nowhere near defensible right now.
You know, that kind of makes me sad, Lyle, because the billions and billions of dollars that we have spent on aircraft like the F-35 and naval ships, and still you say that we are completely unprepared for war with China in the air and at the sea. I mean, I'm making a rhetorical point here about our spending. Well,
hold on. There's another point that I want to make, Kelly, on that, which is that, look, China is a superpower. Some people don't like to say that. I've been going there every year for the last 20 years. China is a superpower. Okay, I think their economy is actually significantly larger than ours. if you think you can fight a war casually 90 miles off the shore of a superpower, I got another thing, to tell you. Do you think China could defend Cuba? No. If the US put its mind to conquer Cuba or any other island 90 miles off of the US, we would have no problem. And China has no problem. I mean, that's the way we have, this is just common sense, folks. Actually, the anomaly is that China was weak for a while.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on. And Zach, I wanted to ask you in this vein of preparedness, of the tensions in the region. Now, we know that over the last decade, the US Navy has been conducting freedom of navigation or phoneop operations in the South China Sea to challenge China's disputed territorial claims. US allies are now engaging in that. Recently, the British Royal Navy, Australia, and Japan have conducted similar phoneops. Are these necessary or are they unduly escalatory? Are they causing more problems, or are they actually benefiting for the deterrence that you had mentioned in the region?
I think too often phoneops have been seen as the answer to all problems in the South China Sea. And I actually have been pretty critical of them in the past, not because I think they're particularly escalatory. I think, the Chinese sort of shadow the ships and then the ships are gone and the problem's over. So it's not that there couldn't be a clash over a phoneop. I just think the likelihood is relatively low. What I think the problem is, though, is if you're Beijing, does this fundamentally change your behavior in some way? I don't think it really does. And if you're a regional state, is a phoneop from the United States really what you're looking for? I don't think so. I think if you're the Philippines, for example, what you're hoping for is that you can use the oil and gas rights that you have in your exclusive economic zone. A phoneop doesn't help you do that. If you're Vietnam, you want fishing rights that you're entitled to in your exclusive economic zone. A phoneop doesn't help do that. So my preference would be to see the US focus more on helping other claimants uphold their legal rights under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And we do have an arbitral tribunal decision from 2016, for example, that's very clear about what those rights are. And I don't think phoneops really help uphold those rights. So I would prefer to see the US do things that support other claimants in their claims. And I'll give you one example from yesterday. So there is a shoal called Second Thomas Shoal, where there is a Philippine ship that's been run aground. And reportedly, Chinese forces tried to prevent resupply of the Philippine Marines that live on that ship a few days ago. That's the kind of thing where I don't think what the Philippines is looking for is a phoneop. What the Philippines wants is a little bit of help in giving food and water to the Marines on that ship, which is within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, according to the arbitral tribunal decision. So I think that's where the US focus should be. I'm not saying that we should stop phoneops. I have no problem with them continuing. I just think we can't believe that phoneops are going to be the answer to everything.
David, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just one minor clarification. The phoneops are not designed to challenge territorial claims. They're only designed to challenge maritime claims. And official policy is that the United States does not take positions on territorial claims for third parties. So it's only the maritime claims at stake that the United States would be taking a position on. But phoneops are a longstanding tool of the United States, and they've used phoneops against all kinds of countries, including friends and allies. They've even used phoneops against Canada, for example, through the Northwest Passage. So they're not really all that big a deal. They're a statement about what somebody believes legally. It's not clear to me that China should be making such a big deal out of them either. There's a kind of a routine Chinese condemnation of the practice as, threatening peace and stability. Well, they don't really threaten peace and stability. And by making a big deal out of them, China just draws more attention to them. So it's puzzling to me a bit that China even bothers flagging them.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the phoneops before we go on, or Lyle?
Yeah, I tend to agree with David here that it's not that big a deal. And I think most of the Chinese argument is kind of pro forma at this point. I mean, I do think one result of phoneops likely will be that China will develop similar close-in surveillance of U.S. areas. And I think, when 10 years down the line, when the Chinese Navy is significantly larger, we shouldn't be surprised to see, Chinese surveillance vessels off of Puget Sound and things like that. And to me, that's not a happy ending for me. I mean, I know international lawyers, I know a lot of them, they're like, yeah, that's exactly what we want. And I say, why do you want, you really want Chinese surveillance vessels off the US coast? I don't think we're better off for that. So it makes me wonder and wonder if we should revisit that. But I will say there's a development nobody's been talking about. That is, China has now completed the high-speed rail into Vientiane in Laos. That's pretty amazing. If you know that terrain, that's quite an engineering marvel. That rail line will go all the way to Singapore through Thailand. That's China's Southeast Asia policy, not these reefs and islands and things like that. That's how they're winning Southeast Asia, folks. The stuff at sea is, I think, pretty much just sort of a game for public consumption. Be tough on the Americans, and the Americans have to be tough on the Chinese. The warships circle each other, without any particular result.
Right. So you don't think that at some point it might be a spark to light whatever tinderbox has been building up over the last few years?
There has been some dangerous behavior. I don't want to minimize that. And I would like to see some de-escalation and some more, but when I talk to American officers who have served out there and been in situations with the Chinese ships, there has been some dangerous behavior. But on the whole, they say, hey, it's all polite. We exchange greetings. We talk about the NBA. It's all good. So I'm not, this doesn't keep me up at night. Taiwan does keep me up at night.
So I want to move on a little bit because one of the things that we've been talking about a lot at the Quincy Institute is this development in which the United States is trying to, wrangle, gather, herd its allies and partners in the region to become a sort of security hedge against China. Recently, Vice President Kamala Harris had traveled to Vietnam and was trying to enjoin Vietnam into getting more involved in a security hedge. And Vietnam seemed to sort of demur very politely. And so there is this question of whether or not the United States is going to try to cajole its allies and partners to be on, to put their thumb securely on the side of the United States against China. And that brings us to AUKUS, the trilateral agreement made between Australia, the UK, and the United States recently to sell or share nuclear powered submarines with Australia. Peggy, I know that you've written extensively about this and have plenty to say. So can you talk a little bit about to what extent the formation of AUKUS impacts the security environment in the South China Sea and open the door to nuclear proliferation in the region?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I do want to speak to this. And in a nutshell, I think it's a stupid move, certainly from Australia's perspective, but actually because the United States, I believe, does care about nuclear nonproliferation from an American perspective as well, and highly provocative. Australia describes it as a next generation partnership, an enhanced trilateral security partnership. The UK has similar words. And the first major initiative, of course, of this new Australia-UK-US partnership is a nuclear powered submarine fleet for Australia, a country with no expertise even in civilian first, just starting with the regional reaction, it has, on balance, not been positive. I mean, there's been some discussion, very useful discussion in earlier panels on the reaction, for example, of ASEAN, and I think we can summarize. I mean, one participant summarized it as, at one end, Malaysia and Indonesia with the most concern, less concern from Singapore and Vietnam, and most embracing Philippines, but all of them had concerns over it escalating tensions and provoking an arms race. And even if we go to Japan, which was probably the most welcoming, of course, that didn't extend to naval nuclear propulsion for nuclear non-proliferation reasons, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that in a minute, because that's an area, I mean, it's been explored by the arms control community, but not nearly enough beyond that. I mean, you know, Canadian Global Affairs Institute, big think tank in Canada, had a session discussing AUKUS and what it means for Canada. And they didn't discuss the nuclear non-proliferation aspect at all. So it really needs more attention. But just getting with respect to where this fits, I mean, Brian Jobe in an earlier panel said this is Australia bandwagoning with the US military containment strategy. And there's no doubt of that. And of course, that's not what most of the region wants. You know, because of their desire, you know, to have good trading relations and other relations with China. So, and from Australia's perspective, I mean, it limits their flexibility. There's the understatement of the century. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs talked about former Australian Prime Minister Keating's blistering attack on this deal, which he called monstrous. And of course, what he was focusing in particular on was how it locks Australia into the force structure of the US. And I mean, it's classified nuclear technology, and the United States is going to control every bit of it. And in fact, the Canadian seminar on this, they talked about this is the dream example of United States relationship with its allies. You know, you really are the cog, you know, you're the cog in the wheel with no independent say. So, this Anglosphere business has been commented on in very negative ways by ASEAN. But now getting to the non-proliferation aspect, because I mean, it's interesting. Last panel talked about areas where South Korea and Japan could cooperate, but of course, on this one, very, very different reactions to the naval nuclear propulsion aspect. Where United States, you know, that's very, very controversial in Japan, and really every indication that they would not be interested in it, even if there weren't legal restrictions. But particularly sovereignty and freedom of action would play for them, as well as the sensitivities, of course, with anything to do with military uses of nuclear power. But on the other hand, South Korea, I mean, they've long had, it's no secret that they've long had aspirations for naval nuclear propulsion, but they've been rebuffed by the US due to non-proliferation concerns. And just to throw in, because we haven't said much about them, New Zealand, of course, their reaction was to reassert their longstanding policy that there will be no nuclear propelled or armed ships in their waters. But now I really want to come to the nuclear non-proliferation aspect, because, you know, this action by the United States is a fundamental policy reversal. Heretofore, it has made every effort to thwart the transfer of naval reactor technology by two other countries, and of course, since its transfer to the United Kingdom, you know, not since. Now, some have said, Victor Gao in an earlier panel said this was contrary to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's not true. What this transfer would do is exploit a well-known loophole, a military use that is not prohibited is naval nuclear propulsion. But the problem that arises is that this means that the fissile material, and of course, here's the real issue, most of these reactors, including the American ones, operate on highly enriched uranium, which means weapons grade uranium, weapons usable uranium, and they have to be taken out of international safeguards for the duration of their use in the nuclear powered subs. So we're talking about huge amount, and that's the dangerous precedent. There's the precedent that's being set. And Australia has said, oh, they'll abide by their commitments under the NPT. Well, unfortunately, of course, this is allowed under the NPT, and they would have to make a voluntary arrangement with the IAEA, which is looking at this very closely, has raised the concern that this would be the first time that a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT was doing such a thing. But the problem for the IAEA is this matter of having international safeguards and at the same time dealing with highly classified technology. So the problem here is not only the precedent-setting value of this is extremely dangerous, and it's globally dangerous. I mean, a number of countries. Well, you know, India has been pursuing talks with Russia about this. Brazil has made it clear it wants nuclear propelled subs too, but France has been in talks for diesel subs and has refused to allow a transfer of nuclear propulsion. But Iran has expressed interest in the latest discussions in the UN General Assembly. Iranian officials said the AUKUS deal was a precedent that they would look at with interest. So it's bad for the region and it's bad for the global community. So I'll stop there. I've gone on long enough.
Thank you, Peggy. That's fantastic. And I saw two hands shoot up, but I don't know who was first. So I'm going to say, Zach, you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of thoughts. So folks that know me won't be surprised that I have a somewhat different view on AUKUS. You know, going back just about a decade, I was, I think, one of the first Americans who suggested that we should consider working with Australia on nuclear powered submarines. I understand all the concerns that Peggy has about the nuclear non-proliferation risks. And I think one of the challenges with the deal, obviously, was the way it was rolled out, and that we don't yet know whether it's going to be highly enriched uranium or low enriched uranium. And I think addressing that issue is going to be really important to help address the concerns that Peggy and many others have about the nuclear non-proliferation aspects. So I'm not trying to downplay that, because I do think that's a serious issue. But I do think there's a strategic logic for Australia getting nuclear powered submarines. And I think it's important, you know, going back to this bullying question that you started with, because when I wrote about this in 2013, I have to tell you, I went to Canberra and Sydney, and people sort of laughed me out of the room at the idea that Australia would ever consider acquiring nuclear powered submarines. It was a crazy idea. There's no way that Australian policymakers were ever going to do something like that, because it would anger China, and you know, Australia's top trading partner is China, and this was completely unrealistic. And oh, by the way, the United States would never sell this kind of technology to Australia either, on down the line. I mean, what we've seen the last few years is, in my view, China really overplay its hand with Australia in an incredibly damaging way to China. And this debate that's now going on about you know, whether Australia should or should not get nuclear submarines is a debate that wasn't even possible to have 2 or 3 years ago. And so I think there's a strategic logic for the submarines, and I've written papers about why I think that makes sense, not ignoring the concerns that Peggy raises on the nuclear non-proliferation issues. But I think it's also just worthwhile to mention, you know, this wasn't a US idea. Right? This was Australia coming to the UK first and then to the US and asking for help, because Australia feels that it sort of has no other choice than to consider capabilities like this. And I think that should tell us something about the dynamics that are going on in the region. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Lyle, you had your hand up.
Well, thanks. You know, great points. And really appreciate Peggy's underlining that there are proliferation consequences. I mean, I can think of many countries that are now going to take another look at nuclear submarines because they see that that's what the that's what the real the big powers or powers or middle powers that want to be big powers, that's how they're going to throw their weight around. And Zach, well, now I guess we know who to assign blame to if this blows up in our face. I guess I'm modestly in favor that I think it's submarines are important. Absolutely. They, much more important. The future of naval warfare will mainly be fought by submarines. So, I mean, that makes sense, but I have a lot of questions. I mean, feasibility, like Australia has no civil nuclear program. How are they going to do this? Will we ever see these submarines? I'm not sure. And if we do, sometime after 2030, where's Taiwan after that? And speaking of Taiwan, I've made the point, and I'll say it again. I like submarines, nuclear submarines are somewhat relevant to a Taiwan scenario, but they are no silver bullet, not at all. And for example, the Taiwan Strait is very shallow. Try to operate a nuclear submarine in there. Not good for nuclear submarines. You probably want a conventional submarine there. So, to me, this is absolutely no silver bullet. China is pulling out all the stops on ASW. And, this is just one more impetus for their own submarine program. And I have to say, I think it's quite likely they'll be ramping that up extensively. And guess who they're going to work with the Russians. And there's already talk of making undersea warfare cooperation a major focal point of Russia-China cooperation after AUKUS. So, I mean, we've got to realize we're in an arms race already. Are we just intensifying the arms race?
Yeah, and I'd like to just continue on this thread of security alliances. As much as we recognize that many of our partners in the region do not want to be sort of used as a hedge in any U.S. containment of China, there are also a lot of mixed messaging coming out, and at the same time, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, was in Washington recently for a Wilson Center event and asked about AUKUS, and he was just gushing. He said, and I'm going to quote him now, he said, "Taiwan is the front line of freedom. We have to be absolutely ready for a continued escalation from China on Taiwan, up to and including a full-scale invasion." The president of Taiwan has said similar things about being very confident in the U.S. backing it against a pending Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Japan, people in Japan, leaders have made similar protestations against China, have talked about building up the defense budget there. At the same time, hearing some of these other concerns. So my question, and this is to all the panelists, if we don't want to see a full-scale war, we don't want to see US-led containment against China, how do we prepare, or how do we help our partners in the region defend, or at least prepare to defend themselves against Chinese influence or encroachments into their territorial claims, into their maritime claims? How do we, and this is one of the labels that we put on it at Quincy, how do we allow them to be porcupines in a way that doesn't require a US-led alliance, but does help our partners and allies defend themselves to take the lead in their own security? And I see, David, you already have your hand up, so we'll go with you first.
Well, I will say something I have said many times in public settings that have made me unpopular. That is to say that China is not an expansionist power. I mean, it's just not. Taiwan is a different kettle of fish because the Chinese think that's their territory, but they have marginal claims against other countries' territories in the remote Himalayas and so on, and that's it. South China Sea, yes, there's multiple overlapping territorial and maritime claims. From a legal perspective, the South China Sea story is just one enormous Chinese own goal. They staked out series of claims that they couldn't possibly defend under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which they signed and ratified. So they're hoist on their own petard there. It's an awkward situation. It's a domestic political problem for the Chinese regime, because the Chinese people actually do think the South China Sea is pretty much a Chinese lake. And, Chinese are smart enough to realize that that's not the case legally. And they're trying to walk that tightrope, as I say. So Taiwan, yes, big problem. Worry a lot about Taiwan. I don't think you need to worry about trying to prevent China from mounting, attacks against Japan or the Philippines or Vietnam. It's just not part of the Chinese dream.
So you don't think they aim to be a regional hegemon, for example?
Not in any classic way of control, like physically controlling foreign territory in large quantities. No, not that. Do they want to have a degree of influence and enjoy a degree of deference that they haven't enjoyed for the last 100-odd years, but did enjoy for thousands of years before that? Yeah, probably. At least certain Chinese leaders almost certainly do. Xi Jinping does too. But, I've never seen a Chinese blueprint for a dramatic revision of the rules-based international order. It's sort of an incremental revision. When China does innovate in terms of global governance, they innovate in a way that's basically complementary to existing global governance arrangements and not fundamentally contrary to it. So I think there's a lot of generalized fear of China doing things that just aren't on the Chinese agenda. And my read of that is that China's got so many internal problems, they can't afford to spend the time and energy to dominate the region. The primary goal of the regime is to stay in power. And, to do that, they mostly have to deal with an enormous domestic to-do list that's incredibly challenging. So Taiwan is the one issue I worry about.
Zach, would you like to follow up on that? Because I sense that you might have a different opinion.
Yeah, so I agree a lot with what David said in part, that we shouldn't, when we talk about China perhaps being revisionist with the existing order, it's a different kind of revisionism that I think many people have in mind. I would just say I'm nervous about asserting that we know what Beijing might do in the future. So, again, to go back to US history, because I think it's an easy way to dramatize that we may know less than we think. If you were to look at the US debate in the 1880s, you had Theodore Roosevelt campaigning against the idea that foreign countries should have colonies. And then less than a decade later, he's the one starting America on a colonial path. And is that because Theodore Roosevelt had a complete change of mind? Sure. But I think some of this is that rising powers change their objectives really fast sometimes, particularly when their perceptions of themselves and what's possible for them to do changes. And when I talk to Chinese friends, I feel that change happening constantly. And so I think it is possible that right now, China has some pretty limited aims within the region, but I'm not positive that that will stay the case forever. I'm not saying that China is going to have these massive global objectives. I'm just saying I don't know yet. And even if Chinese leaders are really sure right now that they don't have those objectives, it still doesn't convince me that they might not have them in the future. And so that's just my nervousness on that aspect of the question. But let me just say one thing really quick, Kelly, on the really excellent question that you also posed about how the US can support allies and partners in being their own porcupines or hedgehogs, whatever you want to call. I think that's a great, great question. And actually an area where restrainers and others agree on a lot of the policy solutions, right? So, I agree with a lot of the writing coming out of the restrainer community that says, look, we should be making sure that our allies and partners are much more capable of defending themselves. Now, how do we do that? I have a lot of thoughts about that. I've written a bit about this. For me, actually, the AUKUS deal is part of this, because I don't think of AUKUS as helping us in a Taiwan scenario. As Lyle mentioned, we're not going to see the submarines come anytime soon, and they probably aren't the best thing that you might need in Taiwan. Where I think they're really helpful is helping Australia protect its own approaches, the maritime approaches to Australia, and not 5 years from now, but 15 years from now. So I think this debate about exactly what the ways are that we should be helping allies and partners defend themselves is a really critical one. I don't know that we have agreement on the exact capabilities, but I think this is a very fruitful area where we could see agreement between, restrainers and people that are maybe more engagement oriented.
Lyle? Oh, your mute button.
You'd think you'd learn after
You better
2
repeat what
years
you
on
just
Zoom.
said.
Okay, I would like to make a final comment on Taiwan, but so if you want, I'll put it all together and just give me my final comment. I see we're coming up to the end here, but as far as like the making our allies out there into porcupines and so forth, I'm modestly supportive. Although I think when you look at the details, it gets difficult. I mean, for Japan, yeah, this seems pretty obvious. Australia, although I will say I think threats posed by China to Japan and Australia are both like really far-fetched and not very credible. I mean, I actually completely agree with David's point that if China's an expansionist power, I don't really see it except for Taiwan. We'll get there. But I mean, I'm concerned about countries like the Philippines, which, don't have a lot of money lying around and have huge threats. Philippines faces an existential threat from climate change, right? Every 2 years they get hit by a super typhoon. Now, each one is worse than the next. Are we really with a straight face going to go to this country and say, we think you should buy some frigates and maybe some, trucks with anti-ship cruise missiles instead of buying, hardened electric infrastructure and bunkers for these towns, which are about to be hit by a super typhoon? I mean, to me, it really is wasting their resources to try to urge them to prepare to fight China, which I think is not a major threat. I also want to say something about Taiwan, but I'll hold off and let other people weigh in if there's time.
Does anybody have anything else they want to add to the question of the security alliances? And I guess my aim was to end this sort of on a more positive note on like, what could we be doing differently outside of the coercion that we seem to be doing right now in the region? David.
Yeah, so Philippines is actually a really interesting wild card. You have a dramatic split in opinion in the Philippines between the pro-China crowd who sort of want to ignore all the security issues and reap the economic dividends of dealing with China, and the people who are still furious that Duterte has not actually cashed in on the 2006 Philippines arbitration tribunal win. And whoever wins the next election may have, there may be a suddenly interesting dramatic change in Philippine policy. The Philippines just don't have the capability to do much on their own. But, if they really wanted to, make a point, they could literally issue an eviction notice for mischief reef, because the Chinese built an artificial island in their exclusive economic zone. Only the Philippines had the right to do that. They weren't asked permission. They didn't give permission. And that would really sort of blow the Beijing, tightrope walking policy out of the water, because they would actually have to flatly ignore the 2016 ruling or admit a serious defeat to the domestic audience that thinks that the mischief reef is in fact Chinese territory. So Philippines can really cause some trouble. And I wonder sometimes what the current situation in the region would be like if the Philippines hadn't actually evicted the United States from Clark and Subic. It might actually be a whole lot more peaceful today than it is.
So I guess since we only have 6 minutes left, and I know Lyle, you said, are you putting up a 2-finger for that last point? Or okay, so why don't we just do this? How about everybody gets a chance to maybe, I don't know, have a conclusion or a last statement, whether it be on Taiwan or some of these other security alliance issues, US military strength, whatever, just to roll us out. And Lyle, why don't you start?
Well, yeah, I don't know if this is going to be uplifting or not, but we're talking about Taiwan. We need to think sensibly about this. We need to study the details. And I'm not saying that everybody should agree on this, but I'm going to invoke a strange voice on this, and that is from the past, which is Donald Trump, who many would say was not a good president and didn't say much that made sense. And his China policy was terrible, I would say. But here's what he had to say on Taiwan, apparently. This is from a Josh Rogan book, and Rogan is not exactly a panda hugger. Trump said, Taiwan is like 2 feet from China. We are 8,000 miles away. If they invade, there isn't a bleeping thing we can do about it. So, maybe that's why some people like Trump, because he was straight talking ultimately. That Americans need to grapple with this. And actually, General Dumford, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was, maybe had more logical train of thought. Anyway, he said in April 2021, Taiwan is responsible for the defense of Taiwan. The United States is not. So, the idea that there's a full up consensus ready to fight a war with Taiwan, I don't think that's at all true. And both Trump and Dumford were acquainted with the war plans, I'm absolutely sure, and knew the truth. It's time Americans get on board with the reality. It's a bridge too far.
And I don't think it's just Americans. I think we're talking about our foreign policy elites here in Washington, including members of Congress, who at this very moment—
I'll say it, the blob.
The blob. This very moment, you have lawmakers on Capitol Hill who are arguing for more money for the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which is our annual spending policy bill, and they're using very highly charged rhetoric about why we need to be militarily prepared to meet the pacing, and I'm quoting now, pacing threat of China. And so I think most Americans, I haven't polled all Americans, but most Americans are war wary. But I think it's our members of Congress, the people who hold the purse strings, the defense industry, who really are ratcheting up the rhetoric and at least pretending that that there not only is war imminent, but that there would be this equal footing, and that we are a superpower. We can win this. We can do this. And I feel like that's driving policy more so than I think Americans themselves, who are so detached from the foreign policy, on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, money. Sorry, who would like to go next? I don't want to hijack the conversation here. Peggy.
I can't resist a final point about AUKUS and the lack of feasibility of Australia doing this. And from that perspective, it might not be such a dumb idea for the US, because they'll get forward basing that they wanted, or basing rights in Australia, and ultimately it will not come to fruition. But my main point is, and my final comment would be that, this containment strategy is not the answer for the United States or its allies. The real answer is a much less confrontational military stance and much more American diplomatic engagement. And cooperation with China on climate. And there was this disagreement over what the readouts were on whether or not the cooperation on climate was conditional on other things. And I think that as a practical matter, cooperation with China on climate requires backing off on the China as enemy rhetoric. And the summit is a very modest but positive start to that. But policy steps need to carry this forward. And so the million-dollar question is, does Biden have the capacity, President Biden have the political capacity to do this? Let us all pray fervently that he does. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. David?
Yeah, so I appreciate the sort of the technical arguments about the unfeasibility of bloodlessly defending Taiwan. I just don't think that's going to be driving what happens if the balloon goes up. It's not consistent with the American self-concept. The Americans don't shy away from fights. They don't really, aren't willing to suffer the indignity of sort of looking like they're weak and cowable internationally. There are real tangible economic as well as moral stakes involved in defending Taiwan and protecting it. So I really do think it would go nasty. I know China likes to talk about red lines and core interests. From my perspective, the right for the Taiwanese to decide their own future is also a red line and a core interest for liberal democracy around the world. How to avoid that conflict? just make sure Beijing understands that. Like, nobody wins from this conflict. And so the best way to avoid the conflict is to maintain some kind of ambiguous status quo, as we've done for a very long time. And I don't think it's necessarily untenable unless it's just on the to-do list. It's on Xi Jinping's to-do list, and he just is unwilling to wait anymore. And what really worries me is that this is the first regime in Beijing that has actually started talking with a sense of urgency and started talking about deadlines, not hard deadlines, but just yesterday, the foreign ministry issued a statement saying that Taiwan will be reunited with the mainland in the foreseeable future. Like, that's, to me, a very concerning statement. Mao Zedong never said anything like that. Deng Xiaoping never said anything like that. This is not a regime that's got endless strategic patience.
Right, and we see those threats were made good in Hong Kong, which was not a military takeover, but a very, a successful social and political absorption over the course of what, 2 years?
And a violation of Beijing's own commitments in 1997.
Zach, I'll give you the last word. And if anybody has a two finger, we got maybe 1 minute left, so.
Well, I'll try and end us on a positive word. So let me say two optimistic things. So first, I think the fact that we're having a much more forthright discussion about Taiwan in particular and China policy more generally is healthy. I think this should have happened years ago, but we were all distracted with other issues, but I think it's a good thing we're having it now. So first, just a big thank you to you, Kelly, and the organizers for putting this together. We may not agree, but it's important to have those disagreements out in public. And then one final substantive point of optimism is, I think very often people in Washington are always looking for the next crisis and next conflict. And look, when I started my career, I was a war planner in the Pentagon. I think mostly about downside risk. So I get this instinct. But I do think we have to remember that at the moment, deterrence is still holding, right? So the sky hasn't fallen yet. And I remain somewhat optimistic that if we do the things we should do, and that requires actual action, that we can maintain deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. So I don't think all is lost yet. It does require us to work very carefully, both in Washington and with allies and partners. But I think there's still agency here for us to maintain stability and avoid a major crisis or conflict. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks to everybody. I know we went over about 3 minutes. I'm not sure if somebody from IPB is going to come back on camera to talk about the next panel. I know the next panel is at 3:15, so it's coming up quickly. Economic connectivity and competition in a multipolar Asia. So we can shift to that, and please look for your links on the website. And thank you, David, Zach, Lyle, and Peggy. This is an excellent conversation, and I wish we had more time, but I know we'll probably be seeing each other in some other iteration and talking about this because